SN Aboitiz Power, powering positive change for 14 years. And it began with a phone call. In 2006, the Aboitiz Group was looking to expand its power business. The privatization of the state's power assets was also underway. Then came a phone call from the Norwegian shipping partner of the Aboitiz Group. It conveyed that a Norwegian hydro company was interested to meet with the Aboitizes. And so began the partnership that significantly expanded the Aboitiz Group's hydropower portfolio and Norway's investment in the Philippines. SN Aboitiz Power is a Norwegian and Filipino joint venture between SN Power and Aboitiz Power. Aboitiz Power is the holding company of Aboitiz Group's investments in power generation, distribution, and retail electricity services. SN Power of Norway is a hydropower developer and independent power producer. In 2020, it was bought out by Scatec ASA, a Norwegian developer and provider of solar, wind, and hydropower as well as storage solutions. SNAP had acquired the Magat and the Ambuklao Binga hydroelectric power plants in 2006 and 2007 respectively through public bidding. Only the power components of the facilities were privatized. The non-power components such as dams and spillways remain government-owned and mostly government-operated. Magat Dam is a multi-purpose dam used primarily for irrigation. Power generation for Magat hydropower depends on irrigation diversion requirement. For the Ambuklao and Binga hydros located in Benguet, SNAP operates the spillway gates under normal conditions based on an operation and maintenance agreement. Ambuklao was under preservation and not operating at the time of privatization. Both Ambuklao and Binga underwent rehabilitation and upgrading. Binga is being operated remotely from Ambuklao. Straddling the province of Ifugao and Isabela is SNAP's biggest plant, Magat Hydro. Magat undertook a half-life refurbishment to ensure that it remains available throughout its lifespan. As impounding hydros, these three plants are designed to capture and store water inflow and use it to generate electricity when it is most needed. With the restructured power industry, SNAP built its business along ancillary services, spot trading, and contracting. SNAP had changed Magat's operations from a base load plant to a peaking plant. This led to greater flexibility in water use, minimal losses of spillage, and increased profitability. Magat was also the first power plant to offer and secure an ancillary services contract, a business offering that continues to this day. It also has contracts with customers. Ambuklao and Binga are also capable of and are providing AS. It also sells to the spot market and is partially contracted. For the past year, SNAP's power business centered on hydropower, but we have been taking opportunities to expand our RE portfolio. The first plant SNAP built is Maris Hydro, completed in 2017. Maris is a runoff river hydropower plant operated remotely from Magat. We piloted our first non-hydro project, the Magat Floating Solar, over the Magat Reservoir in 2019. We also started work on a battery energy storage system in Magat to boost our ancillary service offerings. SNAP has improved the operations of the plants, optimized water values, modernized the facilities, improved reliability and dependability, introduced quality systems, processes, and technologies, developed company culture, competencies, and strategic relationships towards profitability and sustainability. This may be our past, but the story continues. And though our history has many great highlights, many more are yet to come. So, as this story begins with a call, we end it for now with another. Come and be part of the SNAP story.
Building a vibrant and prosperous community through business partnerships is the core mission of NordCham Philippines. the largest Nordic Chamber of Commerce in Asia. Over the years, we built a strong bond with businesses alike, curated and well-profiled members with common goals in advocacy, market leadership, and education. Here are the reasons why you should be a NordCham member. Expand your network. Meet like-minded people and benefit from lead exchanges and referrals. Upskill yourself and your employees. Participate in our forums, workshops, and educational programs. Increase credibility. Your membership brings credibility to your business and positive brand perception. Cost-effective brand opportunities. Build awareness across tested and tailored communication channels. NordCham, your partner for business growth.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This is to inform everyone that we will be recording this afternoon's webinar. All right, good afternoon once again, and welcome to the 9th SNAP Conversations, our climate impact, mitigating climate change through powering sustainability. I am Jane Consolacion from Aboitiz Power's Corporate Communications Department, and I will be your host for this afternoon. A little bit about SNAP. Aboitiz Power is the leading renewable energy producer in the country, providing responsible energy that fosters growth, progress, and success of businesses and communities. Some of you may have attended the previous SNAP conversations, but today is extra special because apart from our high-level roster of speakers, we have the Nordic Chamber of Commerce as our event partner in our continuing commitment to create awareness on various industry topics. NordCham Philippines was established in late 2012 to bring together the Nordic Philippine business community. The objective of the organization is to promote and facilitate trade, commerce, industry, and investment between the Philippines and the Nordic and Baltic countries. With over 100 members, NordCham Philippines is the largest Nordic Chamber of Commerce in Asia. Before we officially start our program, here are some reminders. First, we encourage closing other applications not in use that might be using your bandwidth. Stay engaged throughout the forum and be open to share ideas and ask questions through the Slido link, which you should be seeing on your screens at this moment. Lastly, we encourage everyone to participate, learn, and enjoy. It's called SNAP Conversations for a reason, so let us engage in the conversation. And to officially welcome you all, here is SNAP's Commercial Strategy Head, Mr. Shan Benjamin R. Buico.
Good afternoon, everyone. Are my decks ready? On behalf of SN Aboitiz Power Group, I am pleased to welcome you to the 9th SNAP Conversations in partnership with the Nordic Chamber of Commerce of the Philippines. SNAP is a proud platinum member of NordCham. Today's virtual forum, with the theme Our Climate Impact, Mitigating Climate Change Through Powering Sustainability, highlights the urgency of taking serious actions to address the continuous rise and acceleration of climate change. Sustainability has undergone numerous definitions through the decades, each one more nuanced than the previous. 1987's version captured it best. It is meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. That said, Harvard reviews in business, sustainability refers to doing business without negatively impacting the environment, community, or society as a whole. Businesses no longer look at input, output, income framework, but input, process, output, income, and outcome framework. Climate change is the greatest risk of us all. Across the globe, floods and wildfires are intensifying. Unpredictable weather causes devastating impacts on homes and livelihood. Air pollution affects the health of millions of people. Disasters induced by climate change not only affect human lives, goods, and infrastructures, but also affect countries' development outcomes. They slow down the achievement of the sustainable development goals. Even as we work tirelessly to reduce emissions, further change is inevitable. The most vulnerable are at the greatest risk from climate change. Action to address this and build resilience is needed now, before more people lose their lives or their livelihood. Cuts in global greenhouse gas emissions are still far from where they need to be to preserve a livable climate, and support for the most vulnerable countries affected by the impacts of climate change is still falling far short. COP26 produced new implementation of the Paris Agreement through actions that can get the world on a more sustainable, low-carbon pathway forward. Secure global net zero by mid-century and keep 1.5 degrees within reach. Countries are being asked to come forward with ambitious 2030 emissions reductions targets that aligns with reaching net zero by the middle of the century. To deliver on these stretching targets, countries will need to accelerate the phase out of coal, curtail deforestation, speed up the switch to electric vehicles, and finally encourage investment in renewables. And may I say, this is where the company I work for as an Aboitiz is focused on renewable energy, what we would call responsible energy. It is our great honor and pleasure to have with us the following speakers. Mr. Pedcris Orencio, MAURP, MS Science, PhD, who is an associate professor of the and concurrent program chair of the Diploma in Land Use Planning at the University of the Philippines on Introduction to Climate Change Impacts, Vulnerability, and Resilience. We also have Mr. Jesper Sevingston, who is the executive director of NordCham Philippines on climate change adaptation, mitigation, and management. And finally, Mr. James Hyham, who is senior environmental advisor of SCATEC, who will provide practical insights and methods in conducting carbon emissions calculations. I really look forward to learning more from our distinguished speakers. I am confident that we will find the insights today helpful in sustaining our efforts towards achieving our net zero targets for a greener and better future. Thank you to our speakers once again, and all our participants for taking the time to join us today. I wish you all a successful webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Shan. No, action to address this and build resilience is needed now, like he said, and Snap Conversations is here to show our commitment to create awareness of various industry topics, one of which is climate change, which our speakers will be talking about for the rest of this webinar. And to get the ball rolling, for the first part of our program, we are graced by the presence of Mr. Pedcris Orencio. He is an international researcher specializing in urban and regional planning, environmental risk management, and climate resilience. Mr. Orencio is the former head of the Research and Thought Leadership Department at the Southeast Asian Regional Center for Graduate Study and Research in Agriculture. He also served as the postdoctoral researcher at the Research Institute for Humanity and Nature in Kyoto, Japan, where he worked on coastal risk and vulnerability, the nexus of water, energy, food, and climate change adaptation. He received the International Environmental Leadership Award for his contribution to the Program for Sustainability Leaders and Meisters. He has also served as a consultant for various environmental projects of USAID, JICA, AUSAID, and the World Bank, and was a former faculty member of environmental science at Ateneo de Manila University. At present, Mr. Pedcris is an associate professor and concurrent program chair of the Diploma in Land Use Planning at the University of the Philippines Open University. He holds PhD and MS degrees in environmental science from Hokkaido University, Japan, an MA degree in urban and regional planning from UP Diliman, and a bachelor's degree in fisheries from UP in the Visayas. Guests and colleagues, let us all welcome the super highly esteemed Mr. Pedcris Orencio.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Let me just please just share my screen. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me? Can you see my screen now?
Yep. Yes, sir.
Okay. Okay, thank you. Good afternoon again. It is really a privilege to be in this online event, and congratulations to the organizers. Thanks to Sean for the invitation and Christina for directing me to this topic after a series of going back and forth. We finally agreed that it's best to do an introduction to climate change and tell the story about its impacts and how these impacts vary with place vulnerability and resilience. So my objective for today is to increase your appreciation and hopefully convince you why all of us concerned actors, particularly the energy sector, must push climate actions forward. Okay. Sorry. Okay, so in the next 25 minutes, I will be talking about climate change processes, the physical changes, impacts, and severities expected in different areas. I will then introduce how to best describe an issue using narratives that can be used in executing priority actions. So in this attempt to discuss the priority actions, I will provide some key suggestions on actions and strategies. First, in order to cope with impacts, and second, to contribute to decarbonization. So in this discussion, I would talk about and start this discussion with the topic of climate. But before this, I would like to start the differentiation from the weather. You know, climate is the general weather conditions of particular location over a period of time, and a small fraction of that period that we experience on a shorter basis is actually weather, which tells us if it's warm, cold, wet, dry, chilly, or hot. So the changes in weather conditions tells us what clothes to wear, but climate tells us what to buy. So the difference between them is associated with the time and planning. So speaking of climate, here's a map of world's climate based on Köppen classification system. The differentiation among climate regions is actually based on local vegetation, and they're influenced by temperature and precipitation under changing seasons. There are 5 major types represented by these capital letters A, B, C, and D. Type A is called tropical climate. Type B is arid and desert climate. Type C is temperate climate, and type D is continental climate. Type E, on the other hand, is what we call polar and alpine climate. Among the areas that belong to the tropical climate is the Philippines, and located in the equatorial region, and being a maritime country, it is characterized by relatively high temperatures, high humidity, and abundant rainfall. In many respects, it has a similar climate to countries in Central America. So the moisture content of the atmosphere in this country is due to high temperatures and the surrounding bodies of water. So if you plan to visit the Philippines, come before the rainy season. If you're not fond of the humid weather, you visit Baguio, whose annual average temperature is around 18 degrees Celsius. So to escape the country's general warm weather condition. So, but what really creates our climate? It is the balance between the incoming and the outgoing energy from the sun. So the solar energy that goes through the Earth's surface is either absorbed, reflected, or radiated back to space. The ample amount of energy that remains is used for the physical processes. So when we talk about physical processes, we're actually referring to very important cycles known as biogeochemical cycles. And okay, I'm turning off my video now so that I hope you can still see my presentation. Hello?
The presentation is not on screen.
It's not on the screen. So can you see my presentation now?
Yeah, we can see your presentation. Thank you.
Okay, I'll just turn off my video. I think I'm having internet connection issues. So the process that I've been talking about are actually part of very important cycles known as biogeochemical cycles of elements such as oxygen, carbon, sulfur, nitrogen, water, and phosphorus, where activities flow to and from abiotic and biotic components of the Earth. So the biotic compartment is the biosphere, and the abiotic compartments are the atmosphere, hydrosphere, and lithosphere. These elements accumulate, dissipate, and adjust more rapidly to changes in the biosphere. But there are gaseous cycles such as carbon, water, oxygen, and nitrogen, which tend to move more rapidly than sedimentary ones, those that are sulfur and phosphorus, for instance. Through the cycles, they form and remove naturally by Earth's processes. But when the rate of formation exceeds removal, they accumulate and increase positive radiative forcings and re-emit heat that is being absorbed and coming from the solar energy to the lower atmosphere than to space, thereby contributing to the warming of the Earth's surface. These are usually known as greenhouse gases. So there are more of them, but in terms of their composition, there are top gases that contribute to the greenhouse effects. And these are the ones that are flashed on the screen. So if we go back in time, we can find physical processes contributing to the changes in the climates across eras and periods. So we found from paleogeography and paleoclimate studies that have provided significant evidence on temperature fluctuations, which means the shifts from cold to warm, as seen here, which are brought by various activities, from volcanic activities to land formations to plant colonization and configurations by continents, which happened until the last ice age in this current era, which actually started around 2.5 years ago. But what we are experiencing now is an upward trend in global temperatures, causing changes in climate across the world. This modern global warming that we're experiencing is attributed to the increase in the magnitude of the so-called greenhouse effect caused by increasing concentration of greenhouse gases. So carbon dioxide has been largely attributed to the increasing warming of the Earth. Although among the greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide has less global warming potential than others, like, for instance, methane. But it has been used as a reference for having the global warming potential of one across time periods, and the reasons emissions are actually rated as carbon dioxide equivalents. What we see here are two graphs showing global atmospheric carbon dioxide at its peak measurements. The graph on the left is the atmospheric carbon dioxide and the contribution from the anthropogenic sources. On the other hand, we see that in the past 60 years, the increase in emissions has been faster when compared to previous natural increases. When carbon dioxide increases, we expect climate shifts because of the increase in radiative forcings. As shared earlier, the energy that remains from the solar heat creates a new climate, and this is characterized by increase in average mean temperature, creating areas with more hot and extreme weather and less climate and extreme conditions. With this increase in carbon emissions, we expect climate shifts due to radiative forcings. And as I mentioned earlier, it would complicate a web of processes and systems on Earth and will result to isolated or compounded impacts affecting people, places, and assets. So the foregoing evidence of warming atmosphere and oceans includes diminishing amounts of snow and ice, the sea level rise, and the ensuing catastrophic events. So some of the impacts from physical processes can already be observed around the planet. So the top photo is about the ocean acidification, which is found to alter marine food chains and food supply to humans. Acidification could also decrease storm protection of reefs and affect tourism opportunities and other benefits. Below this photo is desertification, which leads to the loss of biodiversity and worsens the living conditions of many species. On the right-hand side is the ice melt in Greenland, where Greenland, by the way, is the world's second largest ice sheet. And this melting has caused rising sea levels and surface runoff. Some published findings already showed that the rising air temperatures are working with warm ocean waters to speed up this melting process. But on the other hand, there are also typhoons like Haiyan, which happened in 2013. It was one of the strongest tropical storms ever recorded, with winds of 313 kilometers per hour. In some areas, around 280 millimeters of rainfall was recorded, and this fell only under 12 hours. So waves of 7 meters high battered the coastal towns of Leyte province, leaving more than 7,000 people dead and affected more than 1.9 people, making them homeless and and about 6 million are actually displaced. So the overall economic impact of this typhoon is actually estimated at 5.8 billion. This is another photo of an extreme flooding event in 2012 that affected Metro Manila. It's actually not because of a typhoon, but it has created typhoon-like damages. So about 70 to 90% of Metro Manila was affected by flooding, and the floods and rain left 95 people dead, and about 8,000 homes were destroyed, and 6,000 were damaged. So in this event, the effects went beyond social stratification, as both the rich and the poor, young and old, educated and less educated, were in the same situation. Basically, what I would like to share is that events have been increasing over time, and they are affecting more people, places, and assets. And according to the Center for Research and Epidemiology of Disasters, the 10-year average occurrence of disasters covering the period of 2009 to 2018 was exceeded in 2019. Meanwhile, the number of deaths in general is going down, except for disasters caused by floods. One thing about reporting statistics is, of course, this lack of conscience, because deaths are being treated as numbers. And if we look at the real picture of them, it actually lies in the real story of living people. So as we discuss, however, the processes that lead to the occurrence of climate-related disasters and their occurrences, let us not forget that IPCC, the AR5 scientists have agreed and confirmed the human influences on the development of these systems. And the more we disrupt them, the more things get frenzied. So look at the brighter side. This gives us, people the choice to cater to future impacts that also affect us. But first, we must admit that majority of the emissions that contribute to the rise in the atmospheric GHG concentrations are anthropogenic. The largest share is contributed by the energy sector, from which the biggest comes from the industry, or the industrial energy, such as iron and steel manufacturing. Second, we have to look into the contributors. They mainly come from the developed countries. Cutting down on the GHGs would mean stringent policies enforced by countries according to their voluntary commitments in their national determined contributions. And finally, third, the majority of the contributions come from cities, and most of them are from the non-OECD countries. So as cities pursue growth and development, they are more likely to have committed a certain degree of climate change. But for us to have a better understanding of the future of atmospheric greenhouse gases, scientists have provided us with scenarios, and these are referred to as RCPs, or representative concentration pathways, which are actually projected based on the greenhouse gas emissions. So the scenarios are based on greenhouse gas concentrations that would impact a range of temperature changes or possible future climates. So based on the scenarios, average temperatures based on 2010 data likely will increase by 2 degrees Celsius for RCPs 6 and 8.5. RCPs 4.5, 6, and 8.5 will likely contribute to the attainment of the 1.5 degrees. Okay. So, but for us to appreciate better the consequence of the increase in temperature, we have to understand that this will have an impact on the range of on significant factors affecting our lives. So beyond the 2 degrees Celsius, increase in temperature will decrease crop yields and will cause droughts in certain areas and the prevalence of extreme events leading to some irreversible changes. So these climate impacts will have severe consequences for vulnerable areas and affecting people and assets depending on their level of sensitivity. Storms will affect coastal cities, contributing to poor performance of the fishing industry and resulting in the loss of livelihood of small-scale fishers. While being exposed to climate impact, cities, on the other hand, experience a high concentration of assets, and on the other hand, growing number of urban poor communities that exhibit the least capacity for risk reduction that still persists. So as we determine the climate change associated with hazards and their impacts, we acknowledge that these events um, are experienced collectively and have impacts that are differentiated across people, places, and assets. First, they are received according to their level of exposure and sensitivity. And second, they are defined according to both spatial connections such as direct and indirect, and at the time configuration as the current and future. Okay. So the best way to maybe define impacts is determining the physical and social processes that are changing the situation. So by doing this, we consider baseline conditions that serve as references for assessing immediate consequences, which in this illustration include stock reduction, land conversion level, or production decrease. They confirm the reasons for decline in livestock production or loss in GDP contribution or agricultural activities. But sometimes the impact chains can be very complex, such as this diagram, wherein the cause and effect interactions of different physical, represented here by climate factors, environmental, the water systems, and the socioeconomic agriculture variables. So they are in the same place, which are actually, if we look at it on a more integrated manner, we can see that the diagrams will help us in identifying the exposed elements, vulnerable variables, and of course, the impact indicators. But we have to recognize that some systems are actually interconnected, and similar to the diagram earlier, the impacts on one can create trade-offs in services or functions to the other. So systems have emergent properties and the capacity for self-organization. So the proposed management measures and strategies may include looking at their synergies towards achieving common objective. So in this case, the objective is actually to reduce the impact. So at this point, I introduce the need for resilience. So resilience is the process and outcome of successfully adapting to difficult or challenging situations and conditions through flexibility and adjustment to internal and external impacts created either by systems vulnerabilities or brought by the changing physical processes. So the roles of the agents, the systems, and institutions are critical in the process of designing strategies that minimize the risk from impacts. But at this point, let me just show you illustrate this concept. As we know, that risk is a potential negative condition that actually harm people, assets, or places. So this is a highly urbanized city of the Philippines, and all critical roads, networks, and residential areas are overlaid with the flood hazard map. You can find that in the areas that will be affected. So if they are in the same area, they will experience the same level of impact. But others can recover fast from it because of the interplay of institutions and agents. And this is actually what we refer to as resilience. So to build resilience, we must develop adaptation. Adaptation is achieved by reducing vulnerability and increasing adaptive capacity. So to reduce the potential impacts brought by the prevailing levels of exposure and sensitivity, they must be reduced as well. So in this case, what we need to understand is to reduce exposure and sensitivity, which is contingent on the hazards and the magnitude of effects. And of course, noting the conditions of affected people, places, or assets. So taking out poor people from harm's way can be the most practical approach, although it entails following a process. Meanwhile, to develop adaptation, there are critical steps rooted in capacities and provision of support and access, to name a few, that should be developed. So in developing the adaptive capacity, there are steps that are crucial, particularly in selecting and developing a strategy. And they make use of tools. They make use of tools that facilitate knowledge from data analysis and processing. So adhering to the steps will actually help in organizing the information, about vulnerability and exposure of people, places, and assets to effectively design adaptation projects. But the scenarios that we will choose is actually determines the success of decarbonization. Shall we now allow energy-intensive economic activities and unsustainable use of resources? Or are we going to curb these practices and push a regulation for population growth and utilize renewable energy and energy-efficient strategies that do not compromise the environment? The strategies that we consider are actually dependent on the scenarios that we adopt. So adopting low emission scenarios will contribute positively to the reduction of carbon dioxide emissions and will help achieve the target global temperature average. So we can choose from a range of actions that attends to causes of climate change or mitigations and its impacts or adaptation. But however, we must this must be carried out with investments, technology, and capacity building. So basically, investments are part of climate action plan, and that can be developed with various stakeholders in a community to serve as their guide in implementing the strategies. These strategies can be sectoral and by whole community approach so that no one will be left behind on their contributions to climate change scenarios. But strategic measures to address climate impacts can be done by sectors, which can include a mix of both adaptation and mitigation action. Here's an example: prepared for transportation, which is a major subsector of energy anyway. So we're both, the measures here are crafted to respond according to the impacts of climate change effects, such as flooding and damage to infrastructure. You may find that the actions encompass behavior from encouraging park and ride systems to utilization of non-motorized transports, and to implement structural modifications, which, by the way, contributes to a more stable transportation sector. But as we've noted, energy sector is the major greenhouse gas emitter. One strategy that can focus on mitigation is efficient and sustainable energy. And first, this is considered to be the fastest and most cost-effective way to save money, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, create jobs, and meet the growing energy demand, not to mention the benefits, environmental benefits, economic, and the social that they could provide. Meanwhile, energy industries can also explore capture carbon dioxide, carbon capture and storage by capturing carbon dioxide emissions from industrial processes, such as maybe the steel and cement production, or from preventing burning of fossil fuels in power generation. So carbon is transported from where it is produced and then stored underground in geological formations. So these technologies aim to stop at least 90% of carbon dioxide in smokestacks from reaching the atmosphere. But of course, this one is definitely expensive. Finally, as parting messages for this talk, I would like to highlight rationalizing strategies and suggest the courses of actions and measures relevant to climate impacts, as this will push the climate actions forward. Before this, however, we must consider that there are current processes affecting the systems through research and knowledge development. And one consideration for strategies is that they should not be standalone and must be tied with capacity building, technology, and investments to sustain climate actions. And finally, as we are all gathered here, we must contribute to addressing climate change in our sector. We share knowledge, experience, like as this one, and share the best practices so that they can be adopted all throughout the communities. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sir Fed. Applause naman in the chat. No? Thank you, Sir Fed. It's one thing to be throwing around the words fighting climate change, and another to really understanding the technicals and feeling the urgency that comes with that. So being armed with facts and information like your presentation today helps us start effective, significant, and sustainable changes and initiatives not just as companies as we're attending this webinar, but also as individuals in our personal communities as well. So thank you so much, sir. Very good presentation. We would like to remind everyone to ask questions or give suggestions or comments through our Slido link. We shall have a Q&A portion with our speakers before the program ends. And Sir Ped, please stay put as we virtually hand over the certificate of appreciation. SN Aboitiz Power Group and Nordic Chamber of Commerce of the Philippines award the certificate of appreciation to Mr. Pedcris M. Orencio for sharing his valuable expertise and knowledge during the 9th SNAP Conversations titled Our Climate Impact, Mitigating Climate Change Through Powering Sustainability, given this 16th of November 2022, signed by SNAP's Vice President, Mr. Senen Fenomeno, SNAP's President and CEO, Mr. Joseph S. Hugh, and NordCham Philippines' Executive Director, Mr. Jesper Svenningsson. Thank you very much, Sir Ped. Now, our session is not yet over. Allow me to introduce our second speaker for this afternoon. Mr. Jesper Svenningsson is the Executive Director of the Nordic Chamber of Commerce of the Philippines, owner and CEO of EGN, or Executives Global Network in Thailand, and a lecturer for an MBA class in Singapore. On top of that, he has a supply chain and process optimization consultancy company, also in Singapore. Jesper has more than 15 years of experience in supply chain process optimization in international environments in Europe, Asia, and America across multiple industries. He holds a degree in Bachelor of Engineering, Manufacturing and Management, Supply Chain Management Engineer from Syddansk Universitet. I really hope I'm pronouncing that right, or University of Southern Denmark. Everyone, let us all welcome Mr. Jesper Svenningsson.
Okay, thank you so much for the nice welcome. I'm looking very much forward to sharing some perspectives from the Nordic Chamber and in my role as Executive Director there. You can ask yourself maybe my background and the introduction, nice introduction I just got, you know, how relevant is it? How much do I know about climate impact? But that is more from my role as Executive Director of the Nordic Chamber. And of course, all the members that we have, one of them being is in Aboitiz Power, but we have a lot of other companies involved in climate mitigation solutions. Right, I'm just trying to get the screen change working. Here we go. So let me get started. Climate change, adaptation, mitigation, and management is what I'm to talk about for the next approximately 20 minutes. So climate change is here, right? Beyond anything, everything we can do to cut the emissions and slow the pace, we must adapt to climate consequences so we can protect ourselves and our communities. The fallout varies dependently on where you live. It means fires or floods, drought, hotter and colder days, and sea level rise. This is from UN Global Compact, right? This is a statement on their page. This is the statement, I think, related to climate change. So what is adaptation? Well, that's the process of adjusting to the current and future effects of climate change. You know, what will our future look like? And mitigation is making the impact of climate change less severe by preventing and reducing emission of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. I think Professor Pedcris, he explained this very well in details, also what the current situation is. So luckily, I don't have to talk about that. I'm talking about adaptation and then mitigation. So adaptation, I would say, I listed down here 4 key areas: people management, infrastructure management, food management, and water management. Professor Pedcris mentioned some of it a little bit, but I think what is really key, and especially for the Philippines, is that we have a public and private collaboration, and individual actions, they are also needed to adapt to the future. So in terms of people management, we need to communicate more about the risks and requirements. We need to talk about it, right? When I say we, it's both public, meaning the government, and private, we also need universities, schools, education to talk much more about this, so we get awareness about it, and we know how to adapt. Of course, they also need to allocate a significant amount of money. Last amount I heard was $100 trillion is needed in terms of infrastructure management mainly. That's a lot of money. We need to have roads, bridges, underground transportation, energy sources. Those things especially have to be resilient against floods and storms, typhoons, right? Mountains and coastlines, we see that when a typhoon hits here, right? We need more trees, mangroves. I think there's a lot of interesting projects going on, especially on trees around the world. And it seems like bamboo trees is really something that can prevent a lot of landslides. So I hope the Philippine government takes that up and, you know, get more projects going here. There's a lot of interesting projects to look at around the world where there's bamboo. Then we need also, of course, some planning for relocations. Luckily, right now the water sea level is increasing by about 5 millimeters per year. It has been increasing, so we don't know exactly how much it will be, but estimates in 2010 is that that we have 0.5 meter more higher water levels. That's a lot. So there is certainly some that has to relocate. In terms of food management, Professor Petris also mentioned it. I think from the Nordic side of the world, we have to adjust, and also here in the Philippines. Yield optimization programs are really essential. I think this is going to play a much bigger role here in the Philippines than what it's done in the past. We need to have better, more resilient irrigation, much smarter breeding, and new crops. The last two areas is something I know that the Nordic countries are working with the Philippines on already. We are, for instance, sending hundreds of pigs to the Philippines with the right DNA. So they are much more resilient to things, and also much more efficient. You know, there's more piglets, and they grow faster with less need for food. And all of this, of course, is something, as Professor Petris mentioned, it's something that's very important, and also in terms of breeding, in terms of farms, that is really a pretty big contributor for greenhouse gases. We also need to look at water management, desalination, wastewater treatment, and reuse of water. I think those are going to be some key words moving forward. We already seen in Metro Manila, I think it was even last year or the year before, we had water outs where they had to bring in tanks, water tanks, to give us water. There will be need for desalination because the climate will change more and more. Right? Wastewater treatment is something that's barely done here in the Philippines today, and we have great solutions from the Nordics on that. Also on how to reuse it, systems for that. That was kind of adaptation, and I know I'm doing it very quick. It's a brief overview on it. I would say I'm even more keen to talk about mitigation. You know, what can we do now to prevent climate change? Both from the government, the private sector, and individuals, we need to act. It's not just talking about it. I think the COP27 that's ongoing today, this week, and in Egypt, they are talking about that as well, right? They need more to act than just talking. There's been too much talk in the past. I think if we look at the Philippines, there's a lot of learnings from around the world, and that has to be taken into account. Right? As I mentioned under this point with education, best practices from around the world, it is so important on all levels. We need to educate the youth. They are the change. They are going to implement the change, right? They are going to request it. moving forward. That's what's happening in the Nordic countries. You probably all know Greta Thunberg, who is very famous talking about this. She's now stepping down and handing it over to somebody else. But this is important. We need the youth. When I talk to graduates from the university that want to work for NordCham, I always ask them, hey, what do you know about sustainability? What do you know about climate change? And usually the answer is actually quite concerning. It's not much. And this is a problem, right? Because if people are not educated about it, if they don't learn about it, we won't see the change, right? It's going to be requested from everybody. It's going to be requested from consumers, especially. So that's all of us. In the Nordic countries, I can go back, I'm kind of revealing my age here, but if I go back 35 years when I was in secondary school, we had lots of projects every year about sustainability, how to be more energy efficient, and different kind of things at home and elsewhere. This is important. We have to do something like this. Now, if I'm to talk about standards to be implemented, I think there is now a requirement for sustainability reporting here in the Philippines for the biggest listed companies. We need to expand that. We need to make the sustainability reporting go much deeper. It's not just ticking, a sheet and say, yes, we are in compliance. We need to see the actions from the companies, and it has to be mandated. I think one of the things that I always are concerned about when I'm here in the Philippines, and I've only been here for 5 years, so of course there's good projects as well, but building energy ratings, that is both in terms of construction, right? Construction is a huge energy user and contributor to climate change, but also the buildings itself. There's no energy ratings, really. There's some LED for office buildings, but we should have it on normal buildings. Any building that's made should have an energy rating and must live up to certain standards. One-sided glass, aircon, open windows. People, it's almost like having an open window in some buildings. That's how they're built. They don't care about letting the cold air out. We need to do something about that. Labeling of products. This is a Nordic thing. So we have on basically all products, it's possible to get this Nordic eco label. And people are actually looking at it when they're buying things. They're looking, does it have this Swan Nordic eco label on? Because it says that this company, this product, they are living up to a life cycle sustainability. So there's a lot of requirements there. This is something people are asking for, looking at. And I think there is an increasing interest in something like this here in the Philippines. And I really hope this is something that will be adapted. In terms of energy efficiency, cooling and movement of things, this is mainly related to buildings I'm looking at now. Again, aircon, why is it that you sit in an office with lots of people wearing a jacket? Instead of increasing the temperature by 1 or 2 degrees. Why is it has to be 20 degrees or below? The best temperature is supposed to be 23 degrees. That is scientifically based, and even if it's 24, it works well. Let's do these things. Don't accept it if your office has so cold air that you need to sit with a jacket on. Movement of things, everything that moves. Also a big consumer, and say the Nordic countries, we have a lot of solutions for this. We are great on cooling, we are great on movement. If any of you out there wants to learn more about it, just reach out and we will connect you with the right member of our side. Now, it's about acting. It's about us taking action, right? You and your company should think about how you can offer green opportunities, and you should think about how you can use green opportunities. I've listed here, you can see 2 links, and you will get the presentation later. The first one is Junkers. This is wooden floor, wood for your office, right? Instead of using linoleum or tiles, wood is actually 10 to 100 times more good for climate change, right? Because wood is storing the greenhouse gases. So this is a great thing. You can calculate it here. You can convince your bosses to go for more wood. If you choose the Junkers, it's from one of our members, we'd be happy. If you choose something else, that's perfectly fine. Also, if you look at DSV, DSV is one of the biggest logistic providers in the world. And among their solutions, they have green logistics. So you can actually now request to know exactly your carbon footprint, and you can get solutions that are reduced. So not just the regular, but they can have special solutions for this. It's something to request. Now, cannot talk about mitigation without talking about energy, and especially renewable energy. Coal and oil, that's not renewable energy, right? That is black fuel, and we should avoid it as much as possible. It is almost 50% of the energy made here in the Philippines that comes from coal and oil. We have a long way to go. I'm not saying the Nordic companies are perfect on this, not at all, but somewhat advanced. We have in the Philippines, we have quite a lot of gas that's used. That's pretty good. It's much better if we go with hydro. That is, for instance, from SN Aboitiz. Thermal, wind, solar, I think we all know about that. Nuclear, people are saying, are you crazy to mention this? Maybe I am, but I think nuclear solutions these days and time is way better than it was when we had the Chernobyl accident, also even the nuclear plant in Japan. You know, that accident would not happen with the newest solutions. I think another super important thing is biomass. All the waste, all the landfill we have today, it emits methane gas. That's the worst thing for climate change. That's the worst thing about greenhouse gases. That's methane gas. And it's just being in the landfill, and then it goes out into the atmosphere. Really bad, right? Instead, we should use it. We should have waste to energy, much more of it. We should really focus on how to utilize biomass as well as fuel for creating energy. Those are just some of the things. I'm very positive surprised at one of our NordCham's sustainability committee meetings. Not long ago, we had a talk about green energy option program. It's under the Department of Energy. They are really trying to push it, and there is work in place to make this more available for all companies. If you spend today, if you have a certain energy profile, you can apply for this. You can actually decide, I want to get my energy from a windmill, or I want to get it from hydro, or whatever. You can even decide exactly, if it's windmill, what windmill you want it from. That's possible today, and actually it's cheaper. The companies that presented about this, that have implemented it, it's cheaper. So go out, ask your finance or whoever you want to ask in your company about green energy option program, GEOP. Do it today or tomorrow, because this is something that will make a difference. If more requested and change, the better. And it will make all the energy, power energy companies in the Philippines have to speed up the change to renewable energy. I'm almost done. But before I'm done, I just want to dwell a little bit more on waste to waste management and waste to energy. So brief, this is a slide full of a lot of information. Just want to say what's done in the Philippines now, and with the EPR, where manufacturers are being asked to reduce the plastic. That's excellent. But there's a long way to go. In the Nordics, for instance, we have a lot of recycling. So there's a fee, or basically a deposit, for bottles. And then there's a smart reverse vending machine. So when you put the bottle in, you get money. And so nobody throws the plastic bottles anywhere, or glass bottles for that matter. Very important. Something we should implement here. It's just been implemented with a Nordic solution in Singapore, and very well received. Fee on a bag. And I know we are going away from plastic bags, but still, we need a pretty high fee on a good plastic bag, so people will bring their own bags instead. And then shops should really accept to receive back packaging materials, so they have to manage it. So they will work with their suppliers to improve it. Repurposed materials is important. And then invest in waste to energy. I know that there has been some confusion on the law. Department of Justice has recently ruled that waste to energy is allowed. So that's good, and I think there's work on amending the regulations so it's easy, it's clear what is allowed. But over 50% of the waste generated in Nordic countries, it's burned in waste to energy facilities, right? And the rest is basically being reused, or very little of it is used for some other things, and also the waste somehow from the waste to energy facilities, ash and other byproducts, they're used for road construction materials, for instance, making it cheaper, and it actually lasts at least as well. In the Nordic countries, actually, we don't have enough waste to fuel our waste to energy plants. So we are importing waste from neighbor countries to keep the facilities going and provide the energy needed for the country. And you can ask yourself, is it not critical? Why is it that it has been somewhat not allowed or questionable in the Philippines? Why hasn't it been done? Of course, such facilities, they are pretty expensive, but there's been a lot of questions mark on the air quality. And I will say on the next page, I will show you how the air quality actually is in one of the most famous waste to energy plants in the world that's located in Denmark. But with the right filters, you can basically breathe the air that comes out from such a plant straight out of the exhaust. Landfill biogas use methane for biogas solutions. We should use that much more collected and use it. Now, last slide from my second to last slide, sorry. This is just something about plastic waste produced, right? And as you can see on the upper left, we had relatively little plastic waste in the 50s. In 73, where there was a global survey on it, it's still very low, and it has almost around 10 times more in 2016. So in 40 years plus, plastic has really increased, and we need to have the right solution for it. A lot of it in the Nordic countries is incinerated, meaning waste to energy. Little bit in landfill, you can see we have 2%, not so good. And then the export, this is numbers from Denmark, which is not as good as managing plastic as Sweden. So we actually export 28% of our plastic to Sweden, and then they manage it in a proper way. And then we reuse some. All waste, it's much more. It's either incinerated or reused, as you can see. On the lower left, this is how daily life is in the Nordics. You sort your waste. These 2 containers is a household, they have it, and they need to sort the waste in minimum 4 different types of waste, different containers. Where I come from in Denmark, it's 7 different containers, and I know some places it's 12 different containers. Do people do it? Yes, they do. So it's doable, and this makes it possible to do proper waste management, recycling, reuse, and also to burn it properly in a very efficient way. Last slide from my side. This is this famous Amager Bakke or Copen Hill. It's a big waste to energy plant. It has state of the art. It's probably the world's best waste treatment facility. It's a power plant that is also a recreation area. So what you see on the lower left is the plant, and there's actually a recreation area, green area, and it can be used for skiing. So when it gets around close to -degrees in Denmark, which it does and is right now, then there will be snow on it, and it will stay there. So it's very nice, and even if you can see there's some smoke coming out of the pipe, that is all safe. It's not really smoke; it's actually hot. It's fumes from water fumes. This supplies fuel, electricity for 50,000 households. Have in mind that households in Denmark, they are consuming much more electricity. It also supplies 120,000 households with heating. So this is also an interesting thing, and I'm happy to take Aboitiz Power to Copenhagen and show this. We have similar plans in Sweden, Norway, and Finland. So happy to do that. We have some interest from some Filipino companies to go and see this and be inspired for how to do it. That was my presentation. I'm looking forward to questions when we get to that point. I'll hand it back over to you, Janice.
All right, thank you so much. Yes, sir. Pleasure having you as one of our resource speakers. Perfectly complemented Professor Ped's presentation. We got to know and understand climate change with him, and now we know how we can adapt and mitigate at both organizational and individual levels, even at national levels. I was prepared to be to state my amazement at the waste to energy facilities that you mentioned, and then you started talking about the power plant / recreational park, which if you ever do a tour, I should be top of the list, I should say. Thank you so much. We would like to take this opportunity to award a certificate of appreciation to you, sir, and to NordCham Philippines for its contribution as an event partner for the 9th SNAP Conversations, given this 16th of November 2022, signed by SNAP's Vice President, Mr. Senen Fenomeno, and SNAP's President and CEO, Mr. Joseph S.U. Thank you again, Jesper. Please stay put, we'll have a Q&A later. To everyone in the audience, our Slido link is still open for questions and comments on our speakers' presentations. Right, moving on to the next part of the program. The last part of today's learning session, I would like to introduce our final speaker who will be talking about greenhouse gas accounting. Mr. James Hyam works as a senior environmental advisor at Scatec. He leads the company's efforts in achieving net zero emissions while minimizing environmental and biodiversity impacts. Part of his role includes mapping the pathway to net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2040, improving circularity and life cycle component management, and developing our biodiversity approaches to achieve no net loss. He holds a scientific background with specialist climate and environmental knowledge based on a BSc in biochemistry and an MSc in carbon management from the University of Edinburgh. Dear guests, ladies and gentlemen, let us all give a warm welcome to Mr. James Hyam. Hi, James.
Hi, thanks. I'm glad to be here. And thank you to the previous speakers as well. Unfortunately, I didn't get to watch all of them because it's a bit earlier here in Oslo in Norway, and I had to deliver some small people to nursery this morning. And if you're wondering why I have something here on my face rather than my picture, that's because it's November, and sometimes in Europe we have this Movember thing, which is raising awareness about prostate cancer. So that's why I'm growing out this month. That's going to go away after that. So today I'm going to talk to you all about greenhouse gas accounting, and I had some introductory slides which I made before I knew what everyone else was going to be presented. So there's maybe a little bit of overlap at the beginning of my presentation with some of the things you've already heard today. And it's just check if I can go forward. Yeah, there we go. So first, I'm just going to talk very briefly, because I think you've probably already heard most of this already, about climate change and greenhouse gas emissions and where they're coming from. Then I'm going to go on to sort of the meat, if you like, which is about calculating emissions and how to do greenhouse gas accounting, mostly on a corporate level. This is focused on, but it's also relevant if you're doing it on maybe a sort of local level, on a city or municipality. And finally, a little bit about SCARTech and our experience with calculating emissions and also setting ourselves a science-based greenhouse gas emissions target. So first on climate change, unfortunately, climate change is here and it is accelerating. It's now affecting every inhabited region. And many changes are irreversible for hundreds of thousands of years. The last decade is the hottest for 125,000 years. We have to remember humans have only been on the planet for 200,000 years as a species. Extreme weather is getting more likely. Extreme heat events, especially, what used to be a 1 in 10 year event is now a 3 in 10. Happens 3 times every 10 years. Tropical coral reefs are likely to go extinct within the next century or virtually due to the increasing CO2 concentration in the sea as well as the temperature. Melting ice sheets are also probably going to cause at least 0.5 meter of sea level rise in addition to what we've already seen up to this point, even if we manage to get to net zero in 2050. So it's unfortunately a bit of a scary picture, and we've seen this as well in SCARTech ourselves directly. Our operations, we're building a power plant in Pakistan, and with extreme flooding there this year by a sort of stronger than normal monsoon plus more glacier melting. We've also seen extreme storms hit many of our plants. And this is kind of direct consequences for all of us. I mean, here's me picking up some plastic. As plastic was previously talked about by Jesper, this is an issue we see in Europe or as around the world. And this is down the coast at a cabin that it was an old fisherman's cabin that my wife's family owned. They bought sort of over 100 years ago. And this is right on the coast. So it's likely that this cabin, may not be livable in 100 years' time. Something that's been there for 100 years, been the Second World War. The Nazis even sort of occupied this area and things, and there's a history going back however many hundreds of years. But this may be gone if we don't address climate change as quickly as we can. But we can avoid the worst impacts if we act, and we act fast, and we act now. We need to reduce emissions at an incredibly fast rate, which we haven't unfortunately been doing to this point. This is 8% a year we need to do if we're going to reach net zero in 2050 and try and hold the world under 1.5 degrees. This is even possible. A lot of scientists are now saying we're sort of 50-50 on going over 1.5 degrees, even if we cut emissions today. But the budget generally being set now, the IPCC said, is 60 tons of CO2 per person. This is about 8 years of a European lifestyle, or just 3 years of an American lifestyle. People from the Philippines have a lot lower greenhouse gas footprint, so you're much greener in that way that we don't use as much resources, but even then it's still sort of limited. But luckily, a lot of countries have pledged to reach net zero. So they've at least said they're going to do the right thing. And there's been a lot of discussion. We just had COP27 and trying to increase ambition there. And of course, we've got these processes every year trying to push continuously for action. We're seeing good things happening. But still, the graph is getting sort of steeper and steeper when we look at the emissions reductions we need to do. We're going up to 2020 and suddenly the emissions are falling off a cliff and even going negative. So we're setting ourselves a bigger and bigger challenge. And where are these emissions coming from? I think you've already heard a little bit about this, so I won't spend so much time on this, but most of it is carbon dioxide from burning fossil fuels. But a bit is methane, and that's particularly relevant for some companies like us that are involved in hydropower, because this can come from the reservoirs, for example. But also other things like nitrous oxide from cattle and waste, and also these fluorinated gases as well. And carbon dioxide, essentially they're responsible for most of the emissions. This is what's most relevant for most companies because you're using fossil fuels to drive vehicles or travel and things, or have machinery and factories, etc. But also sort of if there's other impacts from deforestation and land use change, for example. And methane is responsible for 6th of the warming, but it's 28 times stronger than CO2 over a 100-year timescale, and even stronger than that over an even shorter timescale. And this is mostly due to sort of our production of meat, especially cattle, but also other things like natural gas leakage. So obviously shifting diet is an essential component if we're going to tackle climate change as well, especially in the sort of developed world where we're eating too much meat. We need to reduce that, even if people say otherwise, unfortunately. But how would you report on your own emissions? What is relevant for your company, organization, whatever it may be, and how do you put this together into something that is understandable by stakeholders and the wider public? So mostly the model that uses this model, and this is from the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which you may or may not have heard of. This has been in use for, not sure exactly how long, but at least 15 years from the World Resources Institute was behind creating this. And this is used by the majority of companies that report on emissions. And there is various things available on their website building on the original standards. There's quite a lot of documentation in there, but they also have various tools to help you report on it. And the way that emissions are broken up is they're broken up into what's called Scope 1, direct emissions. This is where a company, all the sort of, you have to define what your company is to begin with, so to speak, but all the vehicles that are driven, all the sort of, if it's heaters using fuels, or if there's other machines, etc., burning fossil fuels, and all those direct emissions that are within the company's control. So if you can say we can stop driving that vehicle tomorrow, then that is kind of within your control. You need to report in Scope 1. But there's also Scope 2, which is these indirect emissions from purchased electricity and heat. So that's if you're then looking at, okay, we're buying electricity from the grid, and there's a mix of power plants making electricity. What's the average emissions from across that grid? And then you times that basically by the amount of kilowatt hours you use versus the sort of average of the electricity grid. And you have a much bigger category, which is called Scope 3, which is divided into sort of upstream and downstream activities. And this is all the other activities associated with a business, but where a business doesn't have direct control over the emission source. So if you're buying in sort of goods and services that you need to operate your business, whether it's materials or plastic packaging, etc., or if it's transporting things to your factory or your site, it's those sorts of emissions and business travel upstream, but then also downstream, how products are being used. So for example, if a company is making cars and those cars are fossil fuel cars and they're driving on the road, what are the emissions associated with making those cars? So the company has to take responsibility for the entire value chain of the activities and not just sort of look at their own type of area. And for a company like ScarTech, this is the big challenge for us is, we're building renewable power plants. When we're operating a solar power plant, there is very little emissions there, just some vehicles driving around, so we can change those out and electrify them, for example. But we have to look at our further upstream for us and all the modules that are being made and all the other components, because that's where most of the emissions actually are. What to focus on first? How do you go about this? Because it's a lot of potential things to include and can be a bit scary to begin with. First of all, Scope 1 and Scope 2, if you are reporting according to the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, are mandatory, whereas Scope 3 is optional, although, as I said, it's very important for many companies. So you first need to define your boundaries. Where do you have operational, or you can also use something called financial control, and decide that what should be included and what shouldn't be included in Scope 1 and Scope 2, and what should be Scope 3. And then you need to report on your Scope 1 direct emissions, identify all the sources of emissions that you have. How many vehicles have you got? What if you're using generators or other machinery or heaters or whatever it may be that are burning fossil fuels or leading to emissions such as those fluorinated emissions as well. As I mentioned, you have air conditioning units, for example, that are leaking out these very powerful greenhouse gases that are thousands of times more powerful than carbon dioxide. And then also look at your own electricity use, and if you're buying heat or steam or cooling from a company as well, and what is associated with that. And then tackle the big one, Scope 3, which is where you sort of start digging into more and more categories. Often companies find it quite easy, for example, to report on their business travel because they use a travel agent or something. You can say, okay, this is the amount of flights you've taken and this is the amount of emissions associated with it. But if you're then going to take in everything else associated with it, if you've got investments in different companies, or if or your purchase goods and services, that can be quite a job actually to calculate and report on. So that's good to sort of set it out where you're going to focus first, and then have a sort of realistic plan of building on that over time, and not having to feel you have to do everything at once, because that can be a bit daunting and maybe not realistic. And then how do you actually calculate the emissions once you've sort of decided what you're going to report on? First, you need obviously to collect the relevant activity data, as it's called. The best thing to have if you're reporting on fuels, for example, is to have the actual liters of fuel used if you can, or the kilos of coal, or whatever it may be. And then the kilowatt hours, normally you'd say, for electricity. But then you can also do other things as well. If you don't have that data, you can use, for example, spend data to go to the finance department and say, okay, do we have our fuel costs, or do we have some other indirect costs? And then you can translate that back into greenhouse gas emissions. And other things like meter readings or other data that's available. And then when you calculate your emissions, you then take that activity data and you multiply it by these things called emission factors or emission conversion factors. And these are available online from many different sources, or you can, if you have some support from somewhere, you can also use a consultant, for example, to help with some of these things. So various governments sometimes produce these factors, or there could be other organizations. The Greenhouse Gas Protocol has some on there as well. And the UK government, which I've attached a link here if you click on that one, it also has a sort of quite good data set you can use approximately. Of course, it's better to use local factors, but these ones, some of them can be applied quite globally as well. But the more specific the factors, obviously, the better. For example, sometimes you may just have kilometers driven by cars, and then you can then multiply that by an emissions factors to say how much emissions you've had, but then you need to know what type of car it is, etc., and take those things into account to try and get an accurate figure. But what's the value of spending all this time? Because it can be quite a job, and there may not be people who have time, or you may need to get an additional resource to help out, or someone needs to work part-time on this. There are various benefits. So there's kind of the indirect things. One of the key ones being compliance. Often this is required by national reporting, for example, that it is required in the EU now to report on this data, for example, or you could be reporting in accordance with the GRI, the Global Reporting Initiative, and this is one of the disclosures maybe you've chosen to make, or if you're going to report to CDP, what previously known as the Carbon Disclosure Project, or the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, bit of a mouthful, TCFD, is another thing. You may be reporting on your climate risk, and then you should be reporting on your greenhouse gas emissions. And many stakeholders, like investors, are expecting to receive this data now. Also banks and things like that, and even local authorities, as I mentioned, authorities may expect you to report this data. Also for employees and engagement, it can be good to show that you're actually taking your impact seriously, no matter how significant your impact may be. And this can help sort of, increase employee engagement and retention. And it's also the first step to setting climate targets. If you haven't, you always say, if you can't measure it, how can you manage it? So it's important to understand your footprint, to identify where you can make the cuts and where it's maybe most economical and practical to cut emissions, instead of just beginning with initiatives without knowing what impacts that's actually going to have. Also, there could be some direct business benefits of this. It could improve your cost control, for example, when it comes to energy and fuel use. Could identify areas of operational efficiencies. Also, maybe inspire new product lines, or even open up new markets if previously you haven't been able to compete on a tender or something like that, for example, because greenhouse gas emissions has been a requirement and you haven't calculated it previously. So that's a sort of very quick introduction, I suppose, to what is quite a complex topic. So I just wanted to give us a little practical example of what we've been doing in ScarTech as well, and what our emissions look like, and how we've set a science-based target. So I'm not going to go in detail through our emissions inventory, but just talk in general about our company's impact. So first of all, I say we are a company, maybe not all of you are familiar with ScarTech, but we operate renewable power plants all over the world. We have solar power plants, we have wind power plants. We, together with Aboitiz, we also operate hydropower plants in Philippines and some other countries as well. But though we have low emissions because we're renewable, it's not zero emissions. So you can see on this graph, our hydropower down here only emits about sort of 8 to 10 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour, which is sort of the intensity of the emissions over the lifetime of that asset. And our solar power PV, which is our solar power plants, they have a bit higher average emissions, but it's still well below. If you look at coal, for example, over 1,000 grams, or gas over 500, or even if you have carbon capture and storage technology that's often talked about to make these technologies cleaner, they're still much more polluting than using renewable power. But there is still an impact on that renewable power, and we need to reduce all these impacts to get to net zero, even if they are relatively small compared with the other technologies there. And now there's kind of one accepted, I'd say, target setting mechanism widely now, which is a science-based target initiative. And they basically require companies to report on all these different categories of emissions, and then set a target according to what climate science says we need to do to cut our emissions. So it's not necessarily what a company thinks is possible or doable practically. Companies traditionally have set targets. Okay, we'll reduce our emissions 5% here, 10% here, or something, but that's not enough to get to to what we need to tackle climate change. So they're saying that you need to either sort of go for net zero or other climate targets, but you need to be quite aggressive on your emissions setting. And this is backed by some really big institutional investors with over $30 trillion of assets under management, and linked to other organizations like the CDP, the Carbon Disclosure Project I mentioned before, the UN Global Compact, WRI, who developed the greenhouse gas protocol I was talking about, and WWF. And now there's nearly 4,000 companies, maybe 4,000 now, this is about a month or so old, who are committed to taking action, and a few thousand who have now set science-based targets. So it's growing very fast, but this is quite an undertaking. You need to do the other bit first before you get here, but this is an interesting thing to know about. And this is what we've now committed to do, and we're having our target validated now by the Science-Based Target Initiative. And our aim is to try and reduce our Scope 1 emissions as much as possible to 2030. So this is, as I mentioned, not very big for us because we're only operating, well, on our solar power plants at least, we have vehicles and some emergency generators there. So we're going to try and electrify as many of those as possible by getting new EVs in the next 8 years or so. And our Scope 2 emissions, we want to procure renewable electricity for the small amounts of, relatively small amounts of electricity we use on to keep our power plants going at night. And also reduce our indirect emissions, the Scope 3 emissions from our supply chain of things. And eventually we want to get to reduce our intensity of emissions. This is the amount of emissions we have per kilowatt hour of electricity we're generating, by 97% by 2040. Doesn't mean we'll be reducing all our emissions by 97% because we're still growing things. So this would be basically impossible, but we will have to reduce our emissions significantly per kilowatt peak that we install of solar power or wind or hydropower. And also increase our power generation over this time to reach this target. And some of the key actions we're planning on taking, as I mentioned, we want to convert all our fleet across to zero emissions. We also need to reduce these fluorinated gases, such as we use sulfur hexafluoride, SF6 as it's known, in our sort of our switch gears and other electric equipment. And this gas, just 1 kilo of this gas, has the same effect as 22 tons of carbon dioxide. And this is sort of an industry-wide challenge. So we're looking now to see how we can stop using this equipment, because this gas is rising very fast in concentration in the atmosphere. And that's very small amounts released. It's a very powerful gas. This is an easy way we can cut our emissions potentially if we can find the right technology. And also switch away from using diesel backup generators. We don't use them very much, to be honest, but still we need to sort of tackle that. And as I said, we want to procure renewable electricity. And then we also need to work across our different types of technologies to reduce our emissions. So, get higher efficiency solar modules in the long term with lower greenhouse gas footprints by using more renewable electricity in our suppliers, so that they reduce their emissions, and other new technologies and processes, and using more recycled steel, for example, or even green steel made through zero emissions processes. And also look at our transport footprint and how we can optimize this, and hopefully in the future be able to procure low carbon transport, such as shipping powered by ammonia instead of normal fuels. As he said, sort of to reduce our emissions from this level it was previously. So this is looking at our entire value chain, as I said. So the emissions look very high at the beginning, because that's when we're installing a lot of solar power plants and we didn't have much power generation as a company. And that's going to drop a lot as we install more power plants over time, this intensity. But we also need to reduce the emissions in our from our suppliers and transport. And this will be about sort of an 80% reduction per kilowatt peak of capacity we'll be putting in, which is quite a large reduction we have to make in that time, considering the challenges to do that. And get ourselves down to a very low amount of emissions. And then those last bits we'll have to sort of offset by using carbon reductions, where we're pulling emissions out of the atmosphere and fixing them underground, probably using some sort of carbon capture technology at the end of the day in 2040 for any residual emissions to get to net zero. So it's a lot we have to do in that time, but we think it's achievable if ambitious, and we're working with our suppliers and partners and everyone to try and achieve this. And that's kind of everything I wanted to say for today. So thank you for listening, and I hope it was interesting and informative, and I look forward to having some questions afterwards.
All right. Thank you so much, James. Excellent closing presentation. We've got really understanding what we're facing with Professor Ped's talk, and then we got what we can do from Sir Jesper, and here you have what we can do for accountability reporting and what we can accomplish as public and influential establishments to significantly join the global movement to mitigate climate change, protect this generation and the next, and really create meaningful impact. Also appreciate the transparency in relevant operations of SCATEC and your numbers and your targets. I think it adds so much to this learning session. So thank you so much. Please stay, everyone, as we virtually hand over the certificate of appreciation for James, and also for the Q&A, which will be shortly after this. So SN Aboitiz Power Group and Nordic Chamber of Commerce of the Philippines award the certificate of appreciation to Mr. James Hyam for sharing his valuable expertise and knowledge during the 9th SNAP conversations titled Our Climate Impact, Mitigating Climate Change Through Powering Sustainability, given the 16th of November 2022, signed by SNAP's Vice President, Mr. Sinan Phenomena, SNAP's President and CEO, Mr. Joseph S. Yu, and NordCham's Executive Director, Mr. Jesper Svensson. Congratulations to all of our speakers. Thank you so much. At this point, we will be answering our guests' questions. So we opened, and it's still open, our Slido link. Speakers, please be ready to unmute yourselves. Let's check out the questions from Slido. Right, so the first question is, what can you say about the PH urban planning so far? Do you think the government must impose mandatory evacuation along coastlines and other vulnerable areas? I think this one is for Mr. Pedcris, but our other two speakers may chime in if you have some insights about it. Mr. Ped?
Okay, okay, this question about urban planning is really timely, no? Because we are experiencing a lot of disasters right now, particularly in cities. Actually, we have policies in place at the national level, and however, these are really sectoral and fragmented. That's why we should advocate the National Land Use Act. The fragmentation, so this is the problem, no? The fragmentation of the policies, it's actually worsening the issue and causing a lot of disasters because everybody's working in silos. So I think it's better to have that national policy, and through that National Land Use Act, it would actually harmonize everybody, their actions, and then this will create synergies and achieve that holistic development, no? or security. But local governments, if I may add, no, they have this comprehensive land use plans. And in the comprehensive land use plans, these are actually more on actions that are directed to supporting development within their areas of jurisdiction. So the question is, local governments having that least capacity, low investments, no, low capability to implement very huge like solutions, no, to climate change. How can you develop such if climate change, when impacts can actually wipe out this development gains that were put up by local governments? So in a matter of impact, no, it can actually roll back, no, progress and prevent opportunities for sustainable development. So that's really a major concern in this in the issue of urban planning. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. All right, okay, next question. For Sir Jesper, can you expound a bit on why you think nuclear energy is a good option in the context of sustainability?
Uh-oh. Now I might go out on deep water, but I think you see with the crisis in Europe right now, energy crisis caused by the war in Ukraine and lack of gas. You would see, for instance, France, they have 70% of their energy coming from nuclear, and they are bumping it up to more. Germany turned on several nuclear reactors again that were closed down and supposed to close. Sweden have just approved 5 new nuclear plants. I think a lot of places in the developed countries, they are looking at nuclear, and especially new versions of nuclear, as a good option. Of course, there's high expenses. It takes a long time to build, unlike putting up other renewable energy, but it is now defined, at least in the EU, as renewable. And I think the waste, which is everybody's fear, right? How to store that. That is also doable. There's solutions for that now. And just like we have to store used solar panels or windmill wings, right? That's actually a huge problem coming up as well. So I think it makes sense. How applicable is it to the Philippines? with with a lot of natural disasters, earthquakes especially, I think we have to take care where we place it. I know that there's a Danish solution coming up. They have their first prototype in 25. So in a few years from now, on a barge, that's a ship, nuclear with salt molten nuclear, which means that it will not contaminate. It turns into salt, hard physical salt, if it powers down. So that's on a ship, just like there's diesel generators here in the Philippines used today. This is a ship that runs on nuclear that can power an entire island or a city. That is the future, I think. Small nuclear reactors that are movable even. I don't know if any of my panelists wants to.
I think I have to say I agree with a lot of what Jesper's saying there as well. I think Seaborg's a very interesting technology, as you said, and I'm obviously representing Scartech, and we're just a renewables company. But realistically, we need all the options we can get right now that are zero carbon or very low carbon. And nuclear, I agree, maybe in the Philippines or markets that haven't got an established nuclear presence, maybe isn't the best. Maybe renewables are good there, but I think if there are competences are there already and it is a safe area, it's definitely a good option to go for, just because the size as well. We're building solar power plants, etc. They take enormous amounts of space, if we're being honest here, and even wind developments take space, and you can put a certain amount offshore, but not every country has that option. Whereas a nuclear power plant has a relatively small footprint but produces an enormous amount of energy. And Jesper said the EU and their new EU taxonomy, which defines green activities, has said that nuclear is green. There was a lot of controversy over this. Some people feel strongly it's not necessarily renewable, but it is green and low carbon. And I think it's an important part of the solution. And these new technologies could be interesting as well, with modular technologies with other companies, like where I'm from in the UK originally. Rolls-Royce is working on this technology, which could make it cheaper. I wouldn't say that we can sort of guarantee that's going to happen. But even if this is a bit more expensive than the cheapest renewables, I definitely think it's an important option to have in there. And the waste is a challenge, but we can deal with that. We just need good communication with local stakeholders to get a sort of long-term solution to store waste and secure geological reserves, etc.
The nuclear energy option has always been a controversial topic in the Philippines. And I think the question, not solely, but primarily lies on the question of the readiness and capability of the Philippines and the systems currently in place. So I sort of expected this question, but good answers. Here is a follow-up question sort of to that conversation. Agree that present nuclear solutions are better now than Chernobyl, which Jesper mentioned a while ago in his talk, but is the Philippines really, in particular, honestly ready and capable enough to house these solutions? And you mentioned like waste management and good communication with the locals. Any other insights, Sir Ped, if you want to add insights also from your end?
Again, I would like to pick up from safety. I think that this is a major concern, and if we are not properly managing where we are locating our activities, we have to properly zone our activities so that this will not create like impacts or add repercussions if ever there will be incidences of like leaks or anything. So this has been an issue that has been highlighted in during the Fukushima incident. And nuclear power plants lack the safety measures, particularly to which particular in areas where they're located. How do you ensure safety? How do you secure if there are incidences? So and how do you prevent this from escalating? So these are the things that you should consider first before putting up such a project.
Maybe can I make a small comment to that? I totally agree. All of these things has to be taken into place. it will not be allowed to have a nuclear plant if there's not a proper plan for this. So I think that is manageable, right? That is part of the agreement you make if you set up a nuclear plant. How to execute on it is maybe a different question. Without saying too much, I think that is not necessarily what we are the best at here in the Philippines. We have a lot of rules and regulations, and not all are followed by the book. So that is of course a concern. But I think new nuclear, SMRs, and especially if you talk about salt molten, there's not really any risk anymore. There will be more people. This is on my own account, and from what I heard, right, there's way more people dying setting up windmills than there will be dying from nuclear fallout in the future.
I think the cost and the economics and the complication, I think, is the biggest thing to consider. Like, if you can do renewables cheaper, do renewables. If you can do nuclear, well, do it. But learning from the mega projects Europe's been doing right now, there has been a lot of problems with the new reactors. I mean, France and Finland have tried building these things. They've been over 10 years late getting set up, billions over budget. Whereas renewable projects now, they generally come in on budget and on time, sometimes even before time. So yeah, I think Philippines renewables makes a lot of sense. I wouldn't certainly say maybe it's the best place to put nuclear, but you never know with the new technology. So you have to wait and see, I suppose.
Personally, I mean, Nordic countries, we are pioneer in wind energy, right? I hope to see much more of that. But I think applicable for the Philippines is even more on solar. Right? Solar on every rooftop. That should be every new building that's made should have a solar. That's simple, I think. And then a lot more thermal and hydro as well. Potential for it.
All right, next question. Thank you so much, speakers. Climate change is here to stay and it's accelerating. Does it mean initiatives can only be focused on slowing it down? Does it mean it's impossible to revert or stop it at this point?
It's a big question. Maybe I can tackle this first, and then we can go on to the professor and give an answer as well. As I said myself, it is here to stay for the foreseeable future. I think this doesn't mean it's impossible to stop or reverse. I think humans are very innovative when we've got problems, and we can deal with them. We just need a lot of collective effort to do this. And I myself, I have to admit, I read a lot of science fiction, which I think is a good thing to do. I recommend everyone to try that if you don't. Looking away from Star Wars and things like that, but actually ones, looking in the future of what we can do as a species. And I think that's good to think about. We have a situation today, but if we look back 50 years, 100 years ago, our technology is completely different. So who's to say what we can do in 100 years' time? So I think we need to focus on adapting most now, as well as obviously cutting emissions, because it is here and it's accelerating. We need to acknowledge that. And as was mentioned before, when we're planning new developments, we need to think about the impacts. We need to site them right. We need to build things right and to last, not just for the next 20 years, but the next 100 years, because most things are there that long. And we need to be cutting emissions as quickly as possible. And once we've started cutting emissions, we also need to eventually probably start sucking CO2 out and putting it underground in the long term to deal with this. So I think we will have to start, trying to reverse it in the longer term. And it may be, it's very controversial now, but there's other technologies we may have to look at as well, like geoengineering things, like cloud seeding, for example, in certain areas. I saw a report that I thought was a bit scary that over the Pacific now, there's actually less cloud cover than there used to be because of climate change. And they saw this by looking at the moon and how bright the moon is, because the moon is as bright as it is because of the Earth reflecting onto the moon sometimes. And they saw that the Earth is dimming because we're absorbing more solar rays now as there's less cloud cover. So if we can increase that cloud cover, because if we have white clouds, they reflect back most of the sunlight. But if we have dark oceans, it absorb more energy into the climate system. And this is what's happening obviously in the Arctic a lot as well, as we're losing sea ice and it's warming up very fast. Here in Norway, for example, we have a place called Svalbard far in the north, and this is warming quicker than pretty much anywhere else in the world, about 5 degrees, I think, so far, 4 or 5 degrees, whereas the only world's about 1.1 degrees because of this loss of ice and things. So there's a lot of things we have that we maybe need to start looking at. Not that these are things we would like to look at, ideally. We would have liked to have cut our emissions 30 years ago, 40 years ago, but we haven't done that. So we have to start, unfortunately, maybe looking at things that may be a bit worse just because we're at that point. Sorry, it's a bit of a doom and gloom, but we can do these things, I think.
All right. Any other of our speakers would like to chime in on this question, or we can move on to the next question?
If Dr. Petrus, sorry, Professor Petrus, if you're not,
Go ahead.
I just want to mention something from his presentation, right?
Mm.
You saw exactly what James just highlighted. The temperature increases in the north is way higher than the rest of the world. And that's kind of an issue. And we also saw in the presentation that Greenland was melting, right? And this was the first time ever, I think, that there was registered melting all over Greenland. Doesn't mean that all Greenland melted, right? It just means that there was some parts melting. And that's critical, and that it's increasing, right? That what is melting is increasing year after year. That is critical, and that somehow we have to reverse it, because right now the estimate is around 0.5 meter sea level increase in 2100, right? In the 21st, I mean, with this acceleration, which was not foreseen, this level might be much higher. And if all of Greenland melts, I think it's 7 meters that we are looking into. 7 meters increase. Imagine that. That is not something that's going to happen in the next few years, not in our generation, not in the next, right? But no matter what, I think. But still, there's a lot of things, and we really just need to act now. We need to look at all of the small things that we all can do, and then request these things. Request it, right? Don't be shy. Tell your company, tell your parents at home, or go home, tell your partner, hey, we need to be more energy efficient. It's important.
All right, thank you guys. So it's not impossible to revert or stop it. We just have to be protagonists of the victorious kind of science fiction, not the doom and gloom kind. Right. So next question, climate change brings with it different risks according to location. For the Philippines, what are the top 3 policies or issues we need to address to make an impact?
Okay, let me answer this one. Of course, in the Philippines, we also have this nationally determined contributions, no? You call NDCs, and these are actually our commitments to our contribution to the commitment or targets to meeting that 1.5 degrees Celsius temperature target. So in our contribution, we have highlighted both mitigation and adaptation, but actually focus more on adaptation. Why? Mitigation is really costly. So we, as a developing country, we don't have much money to really invest on technologies, and that's why we're collaborating and we're working with other countries as well to achieve that mitigation targets. But on the adaptation, the focus is actually to build the capacity. Capacity to cope with the impacts of climate change. And in our activities in doing this adaptation, we have outlined several policies. And these are actually consolidated in what we call PAMs. These are policies and adaptation measures which are actually undertaken by sectors. So the first sector, I guess, should be agriculture, because that's the #1 emitter, emitter of greenhouse gases. And among the many activities that are being proposed, what is readily applicable would be the alternate wet and drying technologies. So it's not really costly, it's easily adaptable, and it promotes renewable energy. For waste, we still have a lot to go. We have a law that's RA 9003. That's it. And still the country is not performing well in terms of waste management, and we have to make a lot of effort actually to translate these policies into programs, into actions, and to encourage stakeholder participation, because we cannot do it alone. I mean, local governments cannot really take care of the problem alone. On the other hand, there's the energy, and by energy, I've highlighted first transportation. We can promote a different transport system, efficient transport systems. No, it's not always. I think Philippines are. The Filipinos are becoming more car oriented. So I think we have to shift from being car oriented to multimodal transport systems. So these are some of the policies that it's not difficult, but maybe through programs and actions can be translated into solutions that can contribute to this climate change.
Thank you so much, Sir Ped. All right, we're going to accommodate more questions. Next question, please. What are your thoughts on the clean development mechanisms in general? Sir James?
Yeah, I mean, there was the Clean Development Mechanism, originally CDM, which was emission credits for emission reduction efforts, and those helped, I think, push some good initiatives a decade ago. But there was some misuse of that system as well by certain companies, for example, producing these very polluting fluorinated gases that then they could sell CDMs for, to then change their technology afterwards and get paid a lot of money for not doing anything, actually, doing something wrong to begin with. And now there's a lot of, I suppose, around carbon credits, again, are kind of coming up. They sort of died after CDM got excluded from the EU's emissions trading scheme. And now carbon credits going back in a big way. And we in ScarTech, I'll admit, we do sell some carbon credits for some of our projects because we're developing renewable energy in developing countries. And I think if done well, they can be good, but I think there's a lot of risk around these things around carbon credits, because companies, for example, just say, oh, we're now zero emissions because we bought some carbon credits for some forest somewhere, and why was that forest going to be deforested anyway? No, it wasn't. It was just sitting there, or it was growing, or that will get deforested in 5 years anyway, so it doesn't actually help. So I think some of those things we have to watch out for. Norway itself, one thing I think Norway's been very good on, though, is contributing to the RED process, which is the process around reducing deforestation and forest loss in countries like Brazil and Indonesia and things. And I think that is important to have some kind of global work on that, because we do need to do that. And there should be, to be honest, a transfer of funds from richer developed countries that have polluted to poorer developing countries that desperately need those funds to mitigate emissions and adapt to the impacts of climate change already. So I think some of these mechanisms are good, but I think to be honest, most of them today are far too weak. A lot of voluntary systems, people do what they want, but getting governments to sign up to do things that aren't voluntary is very difficult and impossible, as we've seen from these negotiations. And we've seen as well now at COP, just trying to get 100 billion a year in transfer of funds from rich nations to poorer nations they're struggling with. And 100 billion, to be honest, is a very small amount of money for a lot of countries. I mean, the US, for example, spends trillions every year on defense. Norway's been making, frankly, a disgusting amount of money on selling oil and gas recently. And they're not even willing to sort of increase their donations with the current government. So I find it a bit frustrating, because we're all in this together, and it's hard to say to poor countries, oh, you shouldn't build out a new coal power plant, you shouldn't build out a new gas power plant, when Europe and other countries have done this previously and have developed and done a lot there. So there are some good things, but they're not strong enough, I'd say, in my opinion.
All right. Well, that's like a varying opinion on CDM, sort of like a comprehensive review of it. All right, thank you, James. Next question. The Glasgow conference wants to target emissions from before the industrialization. I believe there's a second part. All right, so that could work for first world countries, but for countries still on the rise, the Philippines included, I would like to think, is this realistic?
Can I tackle this one quickly as well, and maybe someone else can say? So I think it's a hard one here, because you've seen, of course, like what China's been doing with their rapid industrialization. They've done it on the back of coal and fossil fuels a lot. And obviously the developed world did this as well, and the developing world wants to copy the model. But I think the important thing to say is when this was done originally, you could say by the UK 150 years ago, there was no alternative. There wasn't fossil, there wasn't solar power. There was some, you could say, windmills and some sort of hydro things that came. But now we have other technologies. So I think it is possible now to develop in a clean way. I think I wouldn't say that means it's easy. There needs to be support. There needs to be investment from other richer countries to support these clean developments. But I think it is possible. And I think it's a real risk if countries think the only way we can do this is a fossil way, because then we will increase emissions that we need to cut. And it is, even if rich countries cut their emissions as quickly as possible, but then if the developing world develops in the same way as the rich countries, we haven't solved the problem. So we're all in it together. So it's not easy, but I think it is doable to develop in a clean way. And that's what, I like being in SCARTEC, because I feel like we're contributing to that. We're building utility scale power plants that's providing affordable energy, reliable energy, that's needed to get that development going. And I think relying on fossil fuels can actually cost countries a lot if they're not, obviously, if they're developing their own fossil fuels to sell, that's different. But if they're having to import things and be reliant on gas and the global markets, it's very risky for them as well.
All right, thank you. Next question. On waste management, do we have an assessment of the impact of using disposable face masks? Should this be regulated?
I don't know. I talked about waste management.
Yeah.
Talk about face masks. I can only say that in the Nordic countries, face masks are phased out. There's nobody using it anymore. I haven't done so for at least half a year. There has not been an increase in cases. There has not been an increase in death. So we could look at that, just like any other suggestion that I came up with, right? Look out in the world, what is happening, what kind of best practice are there, and then take that. I don't have an answer on disposable face masks. I know that it's should be treated as some kind of chemical, a hazardous waste, and that is very difficult to manage also in the Nordic countries. Even more here, where we don't have a proper waste management system in the Philippines. So I think there's a long way to go, and I only think, phase it out. Sorry to say, but phase it out today. No more requirements to wear it indoor or outdoor, except for hospital areas and public transportation, but phase it out. That's the best thing with everything, right? That is to limit it, not to use it, not to use the energy, not to create the demand for plastic bags, etc. Right? Push back from all of us suppliers, all the consumers. That is really what we need to do.
All right, thank you. I think we have removed the mandate to wear masks now. It's still required in certain areas, but yes, and I agree. All right, so just a reminder to our audience, we will possibly not be able to accommodate all the questions, but we will be asking our speakers after the event to answer the questions, and then we will be sending an email for the questions. So don't you worry. But in the interest of time, we will be accommodating a few more questions, and then we will be closing the session. All right, for your next question, what is the plan to dispose of solar PVs and minimize impact to the environment?
I guess I should answer this one, as this is part of my responsibility at SCARTEC. So yeah, I mean, this is a question that's brought up a lot, which is a good question, because it's not necessarily that easy, and it is, now we're putting in roughly a gigawatt, so that's 1,000 megawatts or 1,000,000 kilowatts of solar we're installing this year and then next year, and that'll involve about 2 million solar panels. So that's a lot of solar panels. There's a lot of materials going into those. But just to start off, what a solar panel is, I mean, it's about 80% glass. That's what the sort of sheet is on the front, sometimes a bit on the back as well. And it normally has a frame, often made of aluminium. And then it's sort of silicon wafers, very thin silicon, very similar to what goes into a microchip, actually. And then a tiny bit of some other things like silver and a bit of solder as well to connect things, and some wiring. So when it comes to recycling these, there is a number in Europe. We have quite a good solution, and we have a sort of take back system where you have to get all your solar panels together and they get sent off to a recycler. And But around the other places in the world, it's a bit challenging. We have solar power plants around the world. And what we're doing right now, we're storing the solar panels on site if they get damaged and aren't working properly, so we can find a recycling solution and we're actually working hard to get those established. And what you can do to recycle them, mostly it's unfortunately sort of mechanical process where you often crush the solar panels once you've taken off that frame. The frame is ready to recycle, aluminium is widely recycled. And then you get the glass. We're trying to look at better ways to recycle the glass at the moment, because a lot of it just gets put into roads, which isn't very good use of something, but it's just coming from sand originally. And we could potentially put it back into making new glass, but it can contaminate processes, which is what's the problem. And some of the silicon can also be used in batteries, actually in the electrodes of batteries, but we want to really be able to see if we can get that silicon back into making new solar panels. The sort of copper and the silver and things often are reclaimed and put into new products. So it is possible to recycle most of the solar panels, but I wouldn't say it's optimal right now. But I think an important thing to say is as well, the industry is still relatively new. Most solar panels have been installed in the last 5 years, just because China mostly has ramped up the production so much, and the demand is obviously growing and growing. So we're not going to see the big sort of volumes of waste solar panels come for the next sort of 10 years probably. And then I think it'll also be more economical to recycle these. So I'm fairly confident there will be good solutions, but there will also always be some bad practice here. So this is something we need to sort of make sure of. But mostly they're relatively inert, because most of it is just glass as well. I think that's important to say. And Jesper mentioned before about wind turbines as well. There's a problem with the turbine blades, recycling those. But now companies, for example, are coming with blades that you can recycle just by putting in a sort of acid bath afterwards, and they fall apart and get the materials back. So I'm fairly confident we can find some good solutions, and we're part of an EU research project on this as well. But it's going to take a little while.
All right, thank you. I appreciate the transparency in your answer. All right, so this is the last question, I believe. For the other unanswered questions, don't you worry, the speakers will be answering it, and we will be sending an email with their answers to the rest of the unanswered questions. But for this last question, I will be asking each of you for an answer, and I would like to give you a little challenge. If one of you has already said an answer to this, you can't copy it. So we have 3 different answers for this question. It's a good closing question, I think, for this learning session. Right, so as Filipino citizens, what can we do as individuals or families to not further contribute to climate change on a daily basis? So these are should be really actionable items that we can do easily on a daily basis. Who would like to start? Sir Ped, I think I'm going to go on the order of the speakers. Sir Ped?
Okay, as Filipinos, maybe we should reduce. The first one is actually on waste management. We produce a lot of waste, and we lack the good management system of this produced waste. And waste management actually starts from home. So if we have good waste management disposal practices, then there will be lesser concerns with regards to companies would recycle them or make use of the other waste that can be recovered. So that's the first one, I guess. Second is I'm going to focus more on the behavior actually. Second is actually more on energy. Just switching off the lights when they're not used has a really big impact in terms of energy emitted and production of this carbon dioxide emissions. So, and finally, the transport, that people like to move from one place to another. And we like to use our cars more rather than bicycling or, walking. We have to really practice those things rather than just relying on automobiles. And maybe this will encourage more people to really use bicycles and promote safe ways for people, rather than the roads are really meant for people and that they are not meant for cars. So these are just my insights. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Sir Ped. You've put our other two speakers in a tight spot for giving three things that they cannot copy anymore. But all right, Sir Jesper.
Yeah, now it's hard, huh? You
Yeah.
took a lot of my inputs. I just want to elaborate a little bit on one of them. Right? Um, Denmark, for instance, has been active in promoting bicycling here. There's a reason for that. In Greater Copenhagen, that has 1.5 million people, 1 million people are bicycling on a daily basis, instead of using the cars. I know it's colder, you don't get as sweaty, but we really need to set up systems where it's possible, where it's safe. Right? We need to request that from the government. The bicycle lanes that's made now, it's still on a road full of potholes, etc. Right? That there is a requirement. And there's also a requirement in the office to have a shower facility or something like that. I think that's needed to really adapt these things, right? It's the small things. And it's something, again, it comes from us. We have to request it. We have to ask for it. What we also have to do, one of my pet peeves, it's education. We need to tell our kids that they have to go back to the schools and say, we want to learn about sustainability. We want to learn about climate change. We want to learn how we deal with this. Right? Request it again. It's a demand that has to come from everybody. I don't think it will come automatically from Department of Education. Right? Some of it will, but not enough. We have Nordic companies that are happy to help with materials for the schools. No problem. And then I would say really important is that, again, we all push back. Don't accept a solution that means a bad negative impact on the climate. Try to push it back. I know it's hard. I mean, it's easier when you're in Denmark and even if you're unemployed, you get a lot of money from the government. So you have a different, I don't know if you know about Maslow's pyramid, right? So a lot of Filipinos, it's what are you focusing on in life? What stage are you at somehow? A lot of Filipinos are focusing on getting food on their table tomorrow, right? Or not even on their table, but in their mouth, right? Or having a roof over their head so they feel safe. We need actually to get all Filipinos to be more rich, right? Get more money, because then they will care less about getting food in their mouth and more about the environment, right? Of course, you're not caring so much about the environment. You're not making all of these claims and demands if you are worrying about will you and your family have food tomorrow. So I think that's very important. It's something we all have to contribute to, trying to get that living standard raised.
Excellent
James.
answers, Jesper.
I'm keen to hear
Right,
what you.
I'm going to give James a bit of time to think about his answer. I would just like to appreciate everyone staying. We've gone a bit over time. Now it's 2 minutes after 4. But James will be answering this question, and then we will be going on to the closing. So please stay a bit more, and appreciate you staying, you guys. So, all right, James?
Yeah, and I agree with Jesper as well. I think being a developed country, Norway, one of the richest countries in the world, and telling Filipino people how they can reduce their impact on climate change is sort of an ironic thing, to say the least. But I think there are, because it depends on what situation in life Jesper was saying. I mean, some Filipinos are well off, others have very little. But if you are well off, it's easier to cut your emissions because you have more. Some of the biggest things, people, if you are flying, most people, Filipinos probably aren't flying, but reducing flying and transport is obviously a big one. If you're going to make a new investment, I don't know how Filipinos honestly get around most of the time, but if you are using, a petrol-driven scooter and you need to get a new scooter in the future or something, there are electric options now. So looking at those options. One thing is diet. I mean, as I said before, the Western diet has too much dairy and meat. I'm honestly not sure about what the average Filipino is eating, but if you can reduce your meat consumption, that has a very big impact. And choosing things like tofu or vegetable-based things can have a very big impact there as well. But it can be challenging, and if you don't have much, you can also say that you don't have much impact either. To be perfectly honest, and the avoided purchase is the easiest way to reduce your impact. Often, if you're thinking about, I want to get a bigger car or something, and you need to get that car, that obviously can be a big reduction. But it's hard to say, okay, you can do this by not doing as much. That's not a fun thing to say to people either. So yeah, you have to try and make informed choices, but it's not always as easy as it could be. But yeah, you're doing better than Norwegians, at least. I'll put it that way.
All right, thank you so much. Excellent answers, perfectly doable, easy, whatever you're standing in life. And I appreciate the consideration for the different societies that we belong to, especially in the Philippines, and differences between the capabilities of this country currently and the capabilities of the other countries as far as climate change and what we can do on a daily basis is concerned. And that ends our Q&A. Thank you so much to our speakers. Sir Pedcris, Sir Jesper, and Sir James, your insights have truly enlightened us to innovate more ways to achieve net zero and fight climate change. Right, so to officially conclude today's SNAP Conversations in partnership with NordCham Philippines, we would like to call again on our virtual stage Mr. Jesper Svenningsson for the closing remarks.
Thank you so much. This would normally be our president during the closing remarks. Right now he's in Europe and asked me to take care of it. I would like to thank SN Aboitiz Power Group a lot for this collaboration. Not just this event, but overall. But this is a very insightful event, and we should do much more of this. This is what we really need to do to make an impact. It's educate people, it's inspire people. And we do that at NordCham, and you do that at SN Aboitiz, and together we reach even more people. So let's do more. I want to thank the speakers. I'm super impressed by our two speakers, Professor Pedcris. First time that I met you in a talk like this. Very, very interesting. I'm sure, well, at least I hope it's not the last time that we do something like this, because it was super insightful. The same from James. Thank you for doing this. To our audience, great questions. You put us a bit on the spot on some of them, but that's what it's about as well. It's talking about some of the harder choices that we have to make to impact our climate positively. I made a few points. I think, Professor Pedcris, he mentioned and showed us, the urgency, which is always important if you want change, right? You need to create a burning platform somehow. We need that, and we need people to understand that there is a burning platform. We need to act, right? And more information like this is important. I think what was also said by James is that we need to be ambitious, right? Some of the solutions we don't have now, but we still need to act with what we have. Very important. We need to act. We don't need just to talk about it. So please, when this seminar is done, go home. But before you go home, if you're in the office, make sure that you ask people to turn up the aircon or turn it off altogether. That's the biggest energy consumer. If you have lights on, normally when you leave, turn it off. Turn off your laptops. Save the energy. It's super important. And to James' point on the food, right? The food intake. Yeah, we eat a lot of rice here in the Philippines, and we should eat. We also eat some meat, of course, which is important. The protein is important, but eat more vegetables. Actually, I think we should request. This is hard word, but we should request the government to make more vegetables affordable for more people. Vegetables are too expensive in the Philippines. We need it. It's very important for everybody's development as well, and for the world. So I can only encourage that. And then last but not least, everybody that's attending now, thank you for joining, right, and staying with us to the end. Join more of these events. Tell your friends, your colleagues about these kind of events. Get inspired, get more knowledge. Go out, find it on the internet, everywhere you can, and tell people about it. And to my pet peeve, tell your kids about it and ask them to request more information about it, because these changes, it's not something that's just happening today. It's the future we are talking about. It is the life of your kids and their kids, and we need them to be educated about it to take the right actions as soon as possible. Thank you so much again to SN Aboitiz Power Group, to ourselves from NordCham, and for everybody for joining. Thank you. Over to you again, Janie.
All right, thank you so much, Jesper, and to our guests, thank you so much for staying beyond time. Again, to the unanswered questions from the Q&A, we will be sending you an email with answers. We will be addressing every single one of them. I hope you guys enjoyed and learned so much from our learning session. And most of all, we hope that everyone who has been here amplified learnings from our speakers today and really, truly, and on an exemplary level, be a part of this global movement. Again, I have been your host for today, Jane from SN Aboitiz Power. Have a good day and see you guys in our next Snap conversation. Thank you.